The following program is part of the Renewable Now Media Network and is being brought to you today by the Arpin Group. Arpin, creating customers for life. Rhode Island College, reach, inspire, and connect. WB Mason, for all of your office needs. Cardi's Furniture, and by Colonial Printing, for all of your sustainable printing needs.
Welcome to Renewable Now's Business Side of Green with your host, Peter Arpin. For the next hour, learn how sustainability and business can go hand in hand. And now, here's your host, Peter Arpin.
Thank you so much, Michael. Welcome back to Renewable Now, RenewableNow.biz 1320, WARL. WARA, all the flagships of Renewable Now, and on Blogger, Arpin Green Chat. Today we are going to get back to the conversation around smart cities. And smart cities has a lot to do with changing an environment and growing an economy around some of these growing, expanding urban centers, and certainly using the latest and the best technology from around the world to help us set the stage, manage that, and bring, well, we hope is some economic and equity and growth in those urban centers, environment, and the economy. Today, I am really happy to catch up with Gordon Falconer, and he is the Director of Smart Cities at Schneider Electric, somebody who's been doing this for a while, that presents all over the world. And again, you will find Gordon and Schneider all over the web, as you will our other guest, Jason Dodier, who is now in Washington, D.C. after spending time overseas, including in France. Gordon is the director, as I said, of Smart Cities for Schneider. He was a former director of Cisco Urban Innovation and former strategy head, Masdar City. He is a smart city expert, city consultant, global thought leader in cities, technology clusters, property and infrastructure, has a real background in real estate and approaches this very much through the prism of looking at how that real estate, those buildings, can contribute to concepts around smart cities. Something that we'd really like to see up here in the Northeast, as well as he is seeing in Asia. He has extensive global network within the infrastructure and urban development, including NGOs, consultants, many more. Jason is an international business professional, actively sought after public speaker, delivering business development expertise to audiences around the world. And again, you'll find him both on YouTube and many other sites. After commencing his career with Schneider in a variety of sales and marketing roles based out of the U.S., he has since worked in a variety of functions within the company while living in the Middle East and Europe. Welcome both to Renewable Now. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Peter, for having us.
Both of you, Gordon, Jason, I want to hear a little bit more about your journey and how it prepared you for the work that you're doing today. And you're both part of that Schneider team, which is clearly a leader in transforming our economy around smart growth. We want to know how you're contributing to Schneider's work around that. Gordon, why don't you start?
Thanks, Peter. With being in Singapore and US, easier to nominate one of us, I think. Thank you. Look, I think from there's two components there in your question. The first one is the journey, and I think you mentioned in the very kind introduction, I come from the real estate background. I'm actually a qualified appraiser, which is what I studied at university. So I did a very strange route in that I went via real estate and then became the head of strategy for Masdar City, which was a $20 billion, zero carbon green city in Abu Dhabi, before I then joined Cisco and then Schneider 2 years ago. So my journey, I think, into smart cities is a little bit unusual because the smart city world's populated by urban planners and technologists and architects and engineers, and I come at it from the real estate developments or city development side. So I think it's actually been a good one because it makes me look at things in cities through a very different lens versus I think a lot of the people in the space, and with my role in Schneider Electric is basically I support the global teams in the smart city space because Schneider does a huge amount of work, literally every day in smart technologies going into smart cities. So I tend to travel a lot and work with both the clients, the cities, and the Schneider teams to help bring some understanding between the technology, I think, and the business imperatives, and try and link the two.
Jason, you're still early in your career. How are you approaching it?
Yeah, no, thank you, Peter. And I think Gordon and I provide great synergies amongst each other and within this company. It's a very unique dynamic. So I also took a different path. I've been with Schneider Electric for my whole 8-year career now. And I started out looking typically into the sales and marketing side. I took a big move when I went to the Middle East and went to Dubai. And it gave me a lot of exposure to both open up and see what's happening in different parts of the world, understanding different cultural dynamics, especially amongst Gen Y and people who are shaping the foundational elements of sustainability and strategy and the whole vision around infrastructure in general. And then having the opportunity to really transcend. Schneider Electric is a company that gives you that capability to work in different countries and constantly change that dynamic, but there are certain constants. And Gordon hit on a few things, and we've talked about it in past interviews, but really what I've tried to do in every role I've had in this company is have a realistic but also a very future-driven, oriented mission. And that's really important when you look at this whole sustainability and smart city side. And my closing statement just to start would be, we have many different business units within Schneider, but really the one thing that's tying us all together is that ability to be sustainable, to be modular, and really right-size the components of whatever we're looking to do. And I kind of have an out-of-the-box feel and look for that now, having lived in the Middle East for 3 years and then living in France for 3 years, working on acquisitions and working on both the strategy and operational side. So it's been an incredible experience thus far, and look to continue to provide insights and vision to fellow Gen Yers and also work with institutional leaders and thought leaders across the world.
Well, you clearly are. What's interesting to our global audience spread around the world is you're clearly now on different continents, different time zones. One of the questions always comes up: where do we start? How do we find those? I mean, we have such distance and diversity. How do we find those common starting points towards reshaping cities into a smarter center?
I think, Peter, from my perspective, it's quite straightforward in the sense that every city will have a starting point, in that today is a starting point or 12 months ago was a starting point. Cities basically on their journey towards being smart, have to start at a baseline, and then they work across and I'm sure we'll get into this, they work across the 3 Ps, which are the policies, programs, and projects that will take them on their journey into a future point in time. It could be a 5-year plan, it could be a 10-year plan, it could be a 2-year plan. The main thing is to start, and that means drawing a line in the sand, which is the baseline, and saying, here's where we are, and then saying, here's where we need to be, and by when. And everyone's baseline and everyone's starting point is completely different, but as long as they start.
Repeat those 3 Ps again, Gordon.
Policies, programs, and projects. And I think you referred to one of my presentations of TEDx, where I talked about the why, what, and the how. It's very similar and interchangeable. Things in the world seem to work in threes, a 3-step process.
Well, and it's interesting too. And then, Jason, you're going to jump in. In your presentations, you also talk about pillars around urbanization, digitalization, and industrialization. And so we're going to, in the course of this conversation and in this chat, weave in those elements and how they're impacting cities currently, and how we've got to reshape them, and how it's going to improve things. Jason, from your perspective then, as you listen to Gordon, and when he talks about the 3 Ps, policies, programs, projects, again, you've moved around, you just moved back to the east coast of the U.S. Do you find it difficult to find some of these, and you're trying to help a state like Rhode Island improve around some of the smart city technology? Do you find it difficult to have this cohesive kind of plan and program?
Well, that's a great question, Peter. I'll tell you, across all the places I've lived and visited, there's one thing that stands out to me, and it's really, I really stress the importance of having emotional intelligence and being a good empathetic listener, understanding your community. In order to make this successful, you need to obviously have the appropriate milestones and metrics and that type of thing, but you have to build it and grow upon the people, right? You have to have community engagement. That's really important. And all smart city projects should be inclusive and have full participation of everybody involved. And that's what I've been trying to do as part of a team in France. And as you know, in Rhode Island, we're really trying to gauge what's happening in the community and make sure we connect and communicate that appropriately through social media platforms. So my generation, we grew up on this stuff, and we really need to make sure we're leveraging it to take it to the next level. So I think getting good community engagement, working closely with the people, helping them to understand and educate them, being the real trusted advisor. And that's what we do at Schneider every day, all day, is be trusted advisors for our community, for our customers, and ultimately look to make people better. So communicate, connect, and really build a city and an environment people can be proud of, and they understand what you're doing to make a difference for everybody. So those are the things I've seen constantly that can work when implemented correctly.
Well, and if those basic tenets can move seamlessly around the world, then we've got a good framework for expanding and growing. We talk a lot about the growth in the green economy, this transformation, this transition away from fossil fuel, certainly to clean energy, and then some of the digital elements of the growing economy. As a quick overview, then, smart cities, how important do you think they are, either one of you, to building this global green economy?
I think, from my point of view, and I'll switch over to Jason after that, Peter, I think they're essential because the process to become smart or smarter, in fact, I think it's better to actually describe being smarter rather than being smart, because it's always relative and there's always degrees, but it implies a journey, an activity, and the only way we will transition from existing carbon fossil fuel-based economies into renewable economies effectively is by change and by doing things. And one very good thing about smart cities is that it is seen as a catalyst for change. So I think it really is an underpinning, and I personally think that sustainability is very much interchangeable or part of and built into the concept of smart cities. And as you know, I was head of strategy for Masdar City, which at the time was before the term smart cities, and we were called an eco-city or a green city. And suddenly that term is not used anymore, and everybody uses the term smart city. And I think they are not so much interchangeable, but very much part of each other, and therefore essential to move to renewables. So, yes.
It's almost a maturity. Define for us, and Jason, I want your definition because it seems to be all over the map, but it's the common starting point. Define for us, then, a smart city, and then we'll get into models later on.
Oh, sorry, Peter. I wasn't sure if you wanted Gordon to build on his a little more, but in my opinion, and again, we have our value proposition here, but what I define as a smart city is really when you look at the huge flux or growth towards city environments. I've lived in cities my whole life. We need to make sure that we're putting in place the right stuff from both enabling the energy and gas utilities, so delivering on promises of sustainability there, looking at the water utilities, so more efficiency with water, and then of course looking at building management all the way from the utility to the data center, through railways, airports, and tunnels. So the definition is really to put in place a platform help a city become sustainable to handle the long-term growth projections that we're seeing worldwide today. That's really my focal point when I look at smart cities, hitting on all those key elements. And I've learned a lot about each of those and how they work based on the portfolio that we have at Schneider today, which I'm sure we'll touch on a little later in the presentation. But that's what I would say. We need to prepare ourselves to sustain the massive flow of individuals going into these urban environments over the next couple decades.
And Gordon, you talk a lot about doing more with less. Is that right?
Exactly. And everything Jason said is absolutely perfect. That's absolutely true. But if I was to roll it up into a bit more of a elevator pitch, it's doing more with less with technology. And the reason governments and cities get excited is because they think that with a rarely increasing city budget, and in fact often shrinking city budget, that if they use the smart city technology, they can actually improve quality of life with less money. That's the thing that gets people excited is, we can spend less. So.
Oh yeah, that gets me excited as well. One of the issues, Gordon, I think, is the growth around cities. I thought I heard you say in an interview that over 50% of the population today is in cities and is expanding.
It is true. Although you won't hear me say it in an interview because everybody says it so many times I don't like to say it anymore. Well, it's a little bit like Peter, starting off a renewables discussion with me making a big statement. Hey, did you know the icebergs are melting?
Yeah.
So that's my iceberg statement. So that's why it must be an old interview you heard me say it on. But
well, I think it's again for those of us perhaps who come into it with a little less information and data. To me, it was a big number, and it became important to consider the expansion of those cities. And Jason, he obviously hit on how are they going to sustain, whether it's utilities and grid expectations and traffic problems and reduced air and water pollution and education levels and so forth, access to food. Those things, well, they obviously get amplified as we grow and expand, and even in smaller cities like a Providence. Before we go to break, then, what's the starting point, Gordon and Jason? I mean, really, what the question for me is, well, how dumb are cities now? And are they so limited by their resources like money and infrastructure and available natural resources and antiquated grids? Are they so limited that they're going to have a really tough time making this transition?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I've worked on city projects from Africa to Asia to Europe to all sorts of parts of the world. And, there are some cities where, in fact, I was in India, of course, recently, a few weeks ago. There are cities where I take photos of wires hanging everywhere and open drains and this and that. There's lots of cities that their infrastructure is so far behind that it's a massive challenge for them. Whereas if you think about it, if you're working and living in Copenhagen, which is a beautiful city, a lot of what you see there has been there for hundreds of years as well. And when they work on things to make Copenhagen better, they work on things incrementally. Whereas there's other cities which are, and I wouldn't call them dumb. I think that's I don't think I'd want my city, no matter where it is, to be called dumb. I think, I think the emerging cities, if we have emerging countries, I think we can use the term emerging cities. Their challenge is one of economics and aging or non-existing infrastructure that just has to be replaced, and they're in a different position than an emerged city, for me to say.
Jason,
a minute. What do you think?
Yeah, so dovetailing again off of kind of what Gordon said, I've been privileged. I've had privilege to go to a lot of these emerging countries and see what's happening. And it leads you to wonder, too, with all the technologies being developed by some of these very high-end companies that are flush with cash, how that's going to impact these countries and places going from nothing to scaling up really quickly. But ultimately, to make a city, things work. We talked about this, Peter, with Rhode Island. One of the big things, especially in the United States and Western Europe and places in Asia where you can do this, you've got to have that ICT, that information and communication technology platform in place, right? And just for the listeners, this is really an umbrella of different terminologies or devices and applications. So you got radio, television, cell, all that stuff, the hardware and software that's going to allow you to implement your system. Now, again, as Gordon mentioned, certain countries, we've got a ways to go, and there's a lot of things that need to take place in order to even build that infrastructure. We've seen it firsthand. But for the developed nations and countries that want to implement smart cities, this is a great spot and place to start. And the second thing I would say is, and I'm very heavily engaged in this, is the whole digitization, having a back-end optimized system that can show at a high level what your power usage is and how your waste management and water treatment's looking. So we've got to have those things implemented to really make the jump from being a standardized basic city to implementing best practices moving towards sustainability. And again, just as a closing comment for this first half of the show, it's really that whole nexus of having the financial, social, and environmental factors that's going to allow the city to ensure its own long-term survival. So that's what we're looking at here to really jumpstart this trend.
And we have a good example of that. A town in Rhode Island, West Warwick, just committed to the 2 turbines that will allow them to be 100% renewable energy, which will fix their electricity cost. But they really need the communication systems in order to fully automate their administration and their redevelopment of what could be prime real estate down in Arctic on the river, an old industrial area that could be new again. But as you said, they've got some investment to do in order to handle the redevelopment of that area in a really smart way. Give us a minute. We'll be right back on Renewable Now in the RNN Radio Network.
Today's edition of Renewable Now's Business Side of Green is being brought to you in part by the Arpin Group. Arpin, creating customers for life. Rhode Island College, reach, inspire, and connect. WB Mason for all of your office supplies. And by Cardi's Furniture.
One of the things that inspires us and makes us work even harder is getting feedback, comments, suggestions from our global audience. We are making that even easier as we have put in a 24/7 phone number that will record your messages anytime, anywhere, and give us a chance to respond to you right away. Call us at 401-589-2300 if you want to suggest new content, new shows, guests, or you want to be a guest or a contributor, or have specific feedback on a past story or show. Please make sure that all of your suggestions hit the mark on those areas we cover and report on. 401-589-2300, 589-2300 is our new listener line.
This is RNN, the Renewable Now Network, where sustainability makes sense.
Here's a question for you. Where does the United States get most of its energy? Is it Africa, the Middle East, Canada, or the U.S.? The answer is the U.S. Most of America's energy comes from right here at home. Take the energy quiz. Energy lives here.
Gordon, so you started working early on around this concept. How long has it been for you?
It's basically just coming on to 10 years. actually.
10 years. And in that time, we've seen some good things, and I think we've seen some failures. Everybody wants to know more about what you've seen in terms of investment and return. And your experience, has it been generally positive as cities try to make these changes?
I think so, Peter, but you've got to, you've probably got to break down the expectations in the sense of, if you think about it, most cities are really, they're orchestras at best in a building that's owned by somebody else. So they're trying to make music for the audience, and yet they don't own the building. They don't actually own the orchestra, and and there's somebody sitting up in the wings who actually owns that whole space or parts of it. So the expectations of returns on investment, you've got to ask the question, well, whose return, whose investment? Because at the end of the day, if you think about it, any good city government, or any government for that matter, without getting too political, it's kind of the government's job to put an enabling framework that will incentivize the private sector to actually carry out what the government sector wants done. Now, at that point, that's where it actually starts to get murky, and that's where some of the failures will take place, because some of the enabling framework is not there to actually allow or incentivize the private sector to take the leading role, because there's very few cities that you go to who want to make change who will say, yes, we want to spend all the money and we want to do it ourselves. That never happens. Most governments will say, we want to partner with the private sector. And the failures become how that's all done, and often not necessarily for, let's say, immediate reasons. Often inherited reasons can play a part there in terms of complications between government jurisdictions, federal, state, regional, local, obviously. So it's not fair to sort of say that there's a standard sort of failure or approach that doesn't work, because every city is so different, the way it is actually set up and structured, and then equally their challenges, their locational climate, all the climate issues, obviously, where they are. It's very complicated. Yes, bottom line is everybody wants to know the failures, but what they want to know is how to avoid those failures, and that's where it becomes tricky, because even if they do find a failure and are lucky enough to examine it, sometimes it's not, the knowledge transfer is not as easy as we would hope. I hope that made sense.
No, that's exactly right. But so let's stick with this for a second then. So we talked about local political systems, and we know some of them can be very different around the world. So are there certain political structures that you think move things along more quickly? And why don't you go back and talk about the 3 Ps, policies, programs, and projects? Sure. How can those steps, those 3 Ps of smart cities, be implemented quickly? And what kind of, is there a political system that allows for that?
I guess I'm talking to a predominantly American audience, so the political system one is probably a hot potato. But I'm talking to you from Singapore, which is effectively a city-state and has really jumped ahead since the 60s. Well, Singapore, whether they actually articulate it or not, have really followed the 3 Ps. So they've put in place many times a series of policies. They've then broken the policies into programs, and then the programs are broken into projects. So if it's, for example, if one of the policies is better public housing in Singapore, which the government provides basically about 82% or something like that of the government housing, but of course the people buy it, so it's developed by the government. But that's a policy, is to have better housing. A program is then to say, well, we're going to build 5 new precincts. That's a program. Each precinct might well then be a project.